more of the companies are focusing towards developing the AI functionality into the healthcare, agriculture, education, smart cities, and infrastructure, as well as the smart mobility, which further boosts the demand of stringent AI policy as AI involves your personal data as well. We have an elliptic line of speakers deliberating on the public policy for AI operated world. I would like to welcome Mr. Prakash Kumar, CEO of Vadhwani Institute of Technology and Policy. Welcome, Mr. Prakash.
Good afternoon.
I would like to welcome Ms. Urvashi Aneja. She's a founding director of Tenman Research. Welcome, Mr. Urvashi. I would like to welcome Mr. Gaurav Sharma. He's an advisor at AI at GIZ India. Welcome, Mr. Gaurav.
Hi, good to see you all.
And in last, I would like to invite Dr. Estelle Wang. She is the Vice Chair of IEEE CAS Singapore chapter and Team Lead for Singapore Security and Privacy Competence Center at Continental.
Hi, everyone.
Good afternoon, Dr. Wang.
Good afternoon, Ishan.
Thanks a lot for joining all the speakers. I would request all the attendees to share their questions on the chat and a Q&A window. Also, I would like to inform the session would be moderated by Mr. Prakash Kumar. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Ishan. First of all, let me welcome all the participants here and our esteemed panelists. In this session, we are going to discuss or deliberate on public policy for AI operated world. And Ishan has already introduced our esteemed panelists. So before I invite them, I thought I'll just put in place a few points for them, as well as for the participants here. AI holds great promise in various fields like economics, social, health, security, environmental, manufacturing, agriculture, etc. You name it, and it's being used there or being tried there. In our day-to-day life, we see its use in Netflix, facial recognition, whether it is for attendance or for identifying people from a CCTV grab, quality inspection of products, chatbots, sentiment analysis of social media like Twitter and all, analysis of X-ray plate, and so many other issues, so many other things. So it can help people to acquire new skills, training. It can democratize services. It can help reduce energy usage. It can provide real-time environmental monitoring for pollution and air quality. It's also being used to enhance cybersecurity defenses and also for reducing healthcare inefficiencies. So there are umpteen number of areas where AI is being used. And in the long run, we can imagine AI will be enabling breakthrough in multiple areas, including medicine, basic and applied sciences, and managing complex systems. Now, for all these reasons and many more, researchers are thrilled with potential use of AI systems to help manage some of the world's hardest problems and improve countless lives. However, AI has its challenges like algorithmic bias, which can lead to exclusion, biased recommendations against certain groups of people, elimination of jobs, etc. So in order to realize the potential of AI, the challenges associated with it have to be addressed. And that is where the role of public policy comes. So in this session, we are going to discuss public policy for AI. And we have Dr. Urvashi Aneja. She is the founding director of Tandem Research, an independent research collective based in India that generates knowledge and policy insights at the interface of technology, society, and sustainability. She is also the founder and executive director of newly established Digital Future Lab, which reimagines technology and society trajectories in India through evidence-based research and foresight. Her current work examines politics, ethics, and governance of algorithmic decision-making systems in the global south. She has served on government committees for AI and frontier technologies, and her research has been cited in leading global and national media publications, including BBC, Bloomberg, Times of India, Economic Times. She is also an associate fellow at Chatham House, a fellow of Center for Policy Studies, IIT Bombay, and a former member of T20 Task Force for the Future of Work in G20. She has a doctorate from Department of Political Science and International Relations at University of Oxford. Welcome, Dr. Haneja. Next, we have Gaurav Sharma. As Ishan told us, he's an advisor for AI at GIZ, and he's also an affiliate to the Future Society. Gaurav is the working group member of Global Diplomacy Lab. He was Ambassador Asia and Pacific Global Leadership Academy. He's a German Chancellor Fellow and was awarded New Young Leader by Crans Montana Forum. He comes with 15 years of experience in development, cooperation, international relations, private sector. He's also a facilitator for the Youth Climate Leaders in South Asia and founder of Indo-Swiss Leader Forum. Welcome, Gaurav. Then we have Estelle Wong. She is working as a Principal Specialist Security and Privacy Team Lead for Security and Privacy Competence Center at Singapore. Currently, Dr. Wong is leading team focusing on automotive advanced research projects, consultant and engineering team, and security operation projects, that is, threat intelligence and incident response. She's leading the regulations and standardization of cybersecurity in Asia Pacific. She has deep knowledge of various ISO standards, dealing with cybersecurity, industrial standards, etc. She is the core member of TR68 Part 3 and AI Technical Committee from 2018. Dr. Wong is honored with Top 20 Women in Cybersecurity at Singapore in 2020. She is the only one from automotive industry among all winners. Now, and a little bit about myself. I am currently CEO of Wadhwani Institute of Technology and Policy. And prior to this, I was CEO of GST Network. And I come from Indian Administrative Service, but also work with Cisco, Microsoft. Now let's start the round of discussion. And what I'm going to follow is to request all the panelists on certain subjects. And then we'll go in two rounds. And after that, we'll come for the Q&A session. So round one is on risks with regard to AI, what needs to be understood by policymakers, and what is the status of regulation across the world in this regard. So first of all, I'll go to Dr. Urvashi, who has done lots of work in this area. Urvashi, AI is slowly getting into every field from agriculture to education to health to law and order to manufacturing or to anything you can think of. It is told that AI is the double-edged sword. So what are the key harms and risks with regard to AI, and how can these be addressed? Dr. Urvashi.
Thank you, Prakash, and thank you for the organizers. It's a delight to be here and to be able to share this platform with such esteemed colleagues. So thank you very much. Prakash, thank you for that question. I think it's a really, really pertinent question, particularly in the Indian context where we are right now. I think one way maybe to think about there's a lot of harms and risks, and I don't think we'll be able to cover them all. So I'll just point to a few key ones. One way to sometimes about the harms and risks of AI is to use the analogy of the pandemic. Right? When the pandemic hit, we all thought that the pandemic was in some way a great neutralizer. Everyone was equally affected. But we very quickly seen that the pandemic has amplified existing socioeconomic inequities, whether it's in the world of work or whether it's in social relations. What we've also seen is that certain communities, certain countries have been able to bounce back faster, right? So the pandemic has mirrored those. And in some sense, AI is a lot like that, or machine learning, to be specific, is a lot like that. And the reason for that is because fundamental to machine learning is the issue of data, right? And data by its very definition is always representative. It is always partial, and it always reflects a certain point of view. So in some sense, because we are biased as individuals, we have bias as institutions, we have bias in society, that data is reflective of that bias. And because AI is built on that data, that bias, AI reflects that bias and amplifies it, right? So one of the main risks of the use of machine learning technologies is that we could end up amplifying existing forms of social inequity and social discrimination. And in the Indian context, this is particularly important because we already know, for an example, that more than half the country is still not online, right? And we see that there is, for an example, a huge digital divide in terms of gender or in terms of other marginalized groups. So this issue of reproducing discrimination is really important. So in some ways, you can also think of machine learning as a status quo technology. It produces the future, based on the past. Right. So I think that's one of the main things. I think the second one is around privacy and self-determination. Machine learning relies on accumulating and analyzing a large quantity of data. In some sense, machine learning is data hungry, it's data intensive, it wants more and more data. And what that can end up doing is have implications for people's privacy. And not just privacy, but people's right or ability to determine who they want to be, their self-determination. And the reason for that is that AI, machine learning technologies, analyze people as part of social groups. When you analyze people as part of social groups, you also constrain their ability to move across those social groups, so move across those constraints that come with being in those social groups. And I think, we should be particularly concerned when we're thinking about this privacy point with the use of facial recognition technologies, with the use of emotional recognition technologies, and the use of what you mentioned in your opening remarks, Prakash, the use of sentiment analysis in social media. I'm just picking up on those because you'd mentioned them. I'd like to just add, like I said, the conversation on harms and risks can go on forever. But a point I think is we often miss when we're talking about AI harms and risks is the impact on climate. And I think this is really important because I think in the past year, we've seen the frequency and intensity of climate. The cloud, for an example, is already one of the largest consumers of energy, as well as one of the largest polluters. Data centers alone account for more than 2% of global energy use. Studies have suggested, for an example, that training a single AI model emits carbon dioxide comparable to that of 5 cars over their lifetime. And in fact, making AI models more accurate consumes even more electricity. So there was a recent study that was quoted in the Harvard Business Review that showed that the last 0.08% incremental increase in the accuracy of an AI model took nearly 400% more energy than any of the earlier stages, right? So I think as a developing country, we have to be very, very conscious of the environmental impacts of AI, and we must start factoring this as we think about readying ourselves for an AI future. So I'll stop there, Prakash, but I'm sure we can have a further discussion of this on the Q&A.
Thanks, Urvashi. Now let me turn to Gaurav. Now that she has told us about the kind of threat we have, what kind of capacity building we do for the policymakers so that when they frame policies, they take care of all this? And also, if you can let us know the advantages of open access AI trained data sets. Over to you, Gaurav.
Thank you, Prakash. And again, thank you to the organizers. I'm putting my mic on close to my mouth so that people can hear it properly. But I think fundamentally we should understand that the threat analysis of AI is sometimes overspoken in terms of the current intelligence criteria of artificial neural networks and artificial general intelligence. These are two different criteria. What you are currently picking up is very simple. What you can blink in 1 second is your eye and recognize whether it's a flower, is a rose, or it's a lily or something. That is what you can actually do with the current supervised learning algorithms. We are not in the framework of unsupervised learning algorithms, or even for that matter into deep learning frame, and that's why the consumption of data is very high. Once we actually get into this general intelligence framework, maybe the consumption of data would be low. Not to criticize that, but yes, the factor is sometimes we overstretch our imagination in terms of what AI can do and what it cannot do. Coming to the capacity building, yes, policymakers do not really fundamentally understand how an AI-enabled system really works, or how they can really associate that whether it's a simple process of sensor recognition, of identification. For example, it is better to put for street lights management in big cities IoT sensors than putting AI as a mechanism. So it could be very localized, in a perspective. So the understanding of how AI can be integrated along sectors and in particular problems is fundamentally which is at the cause of capacity building. In addition, for the policymakers, they should understand that AI does not solve all the problems. So it can only solve a problem where there is an A input and an output, as I said, and both are understood very well. If you tell me that there is only an input and the output is not very well understood, I think it will be very difficult to design a completely new AI frameworks in terms of policymakers, and that's where we are doing some. It's taking use cases, and again, use cases in AI are very fundamentally specific to geographies. In cases like agriculture, it could be very, you could develop a model in Ethiopia, it might work, but in India, it might not work. So again, training data sets have to be very localized in the context. So that, I think the fundamental understanding of AI, how it works, why it is there, how it can help you, and how it can facilitate a solution-based approach to your existing problem is to be understood. AI does not fit all the models. Secondly, your question on open access AI, I think this is important from an AI training data sets, because the development lifecycle of an AI application is very simple. 80 to 85% of your time is in data collection or annotation of data, which is looking at AI, a specific model which can be trained on. And then 10 to 15% is basically on designing an algorithm which can, read that data correctly and then, get into a black box and give you an output, which also is known fundamentally what output is. I'm talking about very simple cases. And then maybe 5% is quality testing and then improving the models. Currently, the size of artificial neural networks is expanding. The capacity is big. So the concept of if you have to collect any data sets, people don't want to share it. Because if a startup is utilizing 80% of its capacity in data collection and data creation, it would not like to make it open source. Whereas the fundamental advantage of utilizing open access data sets is that you can really create innovative solutions. So the government should invest its time in creation of these data sets, opening up of these data sets, so that there is an exponential rise in startup ecosystem to actually utilize their brains in writing algorithms and writing AI building AI models. If I tell you in a very simple term, if you take data annotation for AI, it's like a clerical job, like labeling, like what you used to do in Excel sheets. It's a very simple fundamental. So if you spend 80% of your time in a repetitive job of, say, labeling 100,000 images, it's just futile. But if you have big organizations or big techs open up, so I'm just telling you, the voice data is something which is fundamental to a lot of solutions, but voice data sets in India is fundamentally very, very less in terms of low resource languages or in terms of languages, even in the 22 national languages scope, except the top 6, which says Hindi, Telugu, Tamil, Marathi, and so on. The last 10 do not even have substantial data sets. And hence, you can't really derive and make a Google Assist or Alexa to work in those low resource languages. So fundamentally, if you open access AI data sets, and big techs don't do that, let's be honest about it. Facebook, Google, I don't want to name it, but they really will not open it, because, and even the tech, I would say telecom firms. So, I'm just talking one example of voice. So training data sets in fundamentally images or in Earth observation satellite imagery or anywhere, it can really have dramatic impact, because then the startup ecosystem will invest 100% of their time in making models and writing algorithms rather than collecting data sets and standardization of these data sets. We don't really know what standards, and what quality is basically being done. So I'll leave it at that, but yeah, and take it on. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Gaurav. So you talked about opening up the data sets. Even there, some capacity building is required. They need to be told why it needs to be kept outside, what can be kept, and what kind of data sets. Which you mentioned at the end that quality is very, very important. If the quality is bad, then all the inferences which you derive will be bad. Now that's so far we have heard Urvashi talk about the challenges. Gaurav talked about what needs to be done to build the capacity of those who take the policy decisions. Now the third next consequence is somewhere regulation will be framed. We don't have any today, but across the world, regulations have been framed. We have with us Dr. Wong, who is from Singapore. And Dr. Wong, what is the status of AI regulation in Europe and AI standards in Singapore? I'm asking you because you have done lots of work in this area, studied this. And has Singapore come up with some privacy regulation towards the AI uses? And if yes, could you please take us through that?
Thank you, Prakash. Yeah, I'm also thanks for the invitation from DSCI. Yeah, give me the opportunities where I can talk to the people from the region, especially Indian. We also have a very big team from Continental Automotive there. Yeah, so first of all, address this regulation topic. I think this was starting from 2 years ago, along the way with the NISA, European Commissions. Along the way, they published a guideline book. And also ISO has some function safety and assessment framework for AI. Then along the way, now they developed till April this year, European Union, they published the AI Act. Yeah, so in this AI Act, they have been categorized into the high risk, middle risk, and the low risk for the AI model. And take the mobility as an example. Yes, you know that the AI model can be used much popular in the autonomous driving for the future. So this is very critical because we don't understand what the machine was understand that. Yeah. So once you go to this CNN, RNN, ResNet, all this kind of language, only machine itself understood. So how can we as a humans then to certify this kind of AI model and to make sure they are doing the right things where they are not doing the wrong things for us. For example, like they running on the roads, that they make their decisions, things like that. So this has a lot of discussions in the European level, and they come up with the idea with maybe you heard about explanation AI, so that to understand by the humans. And then from there, we can quantify and qualify from the function safety, cybersecurity perspective. And then the government will be giving kind of certifications or the type of approval. So before you really go to the market, you do the useful things or you do the good things for humans instead of you do a kind of risk or bad things for the humans. Yeah, so this is more like, the European level or ISO level perspective. Well, coming down to Singapore, we have organized this artificial intelligence technical community this year. We kick off this discussions is including everything. Yeah, just now mentioned by Prakash that health, governance, defense, including also smart city and all this. Where along the way, we will come up with the technical references in Singapore as the standards, how the AI model will be constructed, where in the end leads you going to the market where, government can regulate you and the user will feel more safe to use that. Okay, then to come down to address that questions, the last questions from Prakash that in this year, we have this PDPA privacy regulations coming to the place in Singapore. And this is mainly talk about, how can I say, in Asia, we don't talk about the human rights too much. Not like a GDPR, we talk about human rights, they come from the law and all this. In Asia area, we are coming from based on the consigned form. Consigned form means that, okay, once I sign the form, okay, I basically sold myself, my personal information to some companies, right? So this is, but however, the government trying to say, for example, if you are running apps where you're touching the human like health, But definitely as an app company, I want to improve my user experiences regarding to this AI model. I want the data to train my model and improve my user experiences. But however, along the way, you will collect some sensitive data, and this data will lead you to identify it as a personal information. So here, the government were very strong to say that, okay, you need to treat this data with a certain way of anonymization or pseudo numbers where you cannot disclose the personal data. For example, some address or your name, your ID, because this is nothing to do with you want to improve the health apps monitoring from the company perspective. In such a case, yes, strictly mentioned, you need to do a data anonymization. If you want to use this data, you train your AI model. Yeah, I come back to you, Prakash. Thank you.
Sorry, my microphone was muted. Thank you very much, Dr. Wong. Now, before we go to the second round, and I'll start from where she left, that is, she talked about the regulation in Europe and what has happened in Singapore, and we don't have any. But before that, can I request all the attendees, if they have any question, please put them in the chat box or the Q&A so that the panelists can see them and respond. And if your question is for a particular panelist, please put her or his name so they can be seen by them and answered by them. Okay, so Urvashi, she talked about the regulatory positions in Europe and Singapore. Now, we don't have currently any regulation. So what are the different regulatory options to govern AI and which are most suited to the Indian context? Over to you, Urvashi.
Thanks, Prakash. I guess maybe the first thing I would like to say is that we should be very conscious that there's no easy or simple or quick fixes to this, right? So like Estelle had mentioned, data anonymization, there's now conversations around differentiated privacy models, but we also know that these models are not 100% or they're not foolproof, right? So I think that one of the things we have to realize is that many of the solutions that we're posing right now are still very much in a testing stage. And so for critical sectors, critical decision-making sectors, we should be cautious about the use of AI in the first place because the solutions we have are not ready yet to address some of the harms that we spoke about. That being said, I think we can think about the kind of regulatory approaches emerging globally and in India in a couple of different ways. One of the ways that we see emerging is a risk-based approach to AI regulation. We see that in the EU, for an example. Even Niti Aayog, in its articulation of its responsible AI framework, talks about the need for a risk-based approach. A risk-based approach certainly has certain advantages. It allows you to experiment. It allows you to enable a more innovative ecosystem without clamping down too early with top-down regulation. But it is very important that for a risk-based approach, we have the right expertise in place, because a risk-based approach requires us to make, in some sense, objective scientific assessments of what the risk might be and to be able to quantify that risk. And for that, we need the right expertise in place. That being said, a risk-based approach is fundamentally, it tries to make something objective where it is fundamentally also a subjective decision, right? So there is a limitation, therefore, to taking a risk-based approach. I think what we are also seeing is the increasing use of standards in the space of AI, and Estelle already spoke about some of this. There is a risk when we talk about standards too much that we could end up allowing the private sector to self-regulate. And we do need some amount of self-regulation, but we need to balance that self-regulation with more top-down regulation. It poses a challenge in the Indian context because the state may not have the capacity in the current context context to be able to govern effectively. And so it is important to include a standard-based approach in our kind of portfolio of regulatory options. But it's also really important that we include a human rights-based perspective and we anchor AI regulation to our constitutional framework, because that ultimately is what is set up to protect individuals and to protect their rights. Again, there are limitations even to a human rights-based framework and to relying on constitutional frameworks. The Indian Constitution, for an example, doesn't have a framework to think about discrimination, right? So when we think about AI and the impacts in terms of social discrimination, we don't have a ready framework for it. Human rights-based approaches also, again, require institutional capacity. You need to have the regulatory capacity to be able to make those frameworks meaningful enough to protect people. And often those frameworks come into play after harm has already happened, right? So again, important, but it's not the complete solution. We also need to think about more upstream management processes, so more upstream governance of innovation itself, which means thinking about research and development, thinking about how we build better linkages between industry and academia, how we build in foresight methods, how we build in public participation into the deliberation of these new technologies. So what we'll need is a combination of various types of approaches. We'll need risk-based approaches, we'll need standards, we'll need a rights-based approach, we'll need market policies, and we'll also need the upstream governance of innovation processes. So all of these are really important, but fundamentally, it really comes down to the question of institutional capacity, which is the point that even you and Gaurav were discussing earlier, particularly in the Indian context. Thanks, Prakash.
So Urvashi, I'm curious to know how much of work is being done in this area, all the things which you mentioned. I mean, are we doing something, both the government as well as the civil society?
I don't see too much happening right now at the government level. I think the government has put out a few kind of working papers, discussion documents that articulate that they would like to follow a risk-based approach and they would like to anchor AI governance to principles of fairness, accountability, and transparency. But these so far remain as kind of very top-level conversations or statements of intent, right, rather than fully thought out and developed frameworks for policy. That being said, governments all over the world are struggling with this. Even in the EU, for an example, it took them a long time to come up with the risk-based framework. And in fact, there's been a lot of discussion about the utility and applicability and the legitimacy of that risk-based framework. I think one of the big differences in the EU and Indian context is in the EU, there was a huge amount of civil society participation and response to those risk-based frameworks. And there are well-organized mechanisms for taking on board that feedback. And so we really need to ensure that in the Indian context also, we're creating enough space and enough meaningful dialogue between civil society and government so that we can articulate these frameworks in a more grounded sense. So we have a long way to go, Prakash, essentially. But the worry is that the technology is already out in the market and many of the harmful use cases are already out in the market. So we also have to move fast.
Thanks, Urvashi. I mean, then we'll fall on our face and then get up and we'll learn from there and then go ahead. Okay. So Gaurav C raised a very interesting issue that how much should be regulated and how much we should leave the private sector to self-regulate. What are your views on that?
Yeah, it's a chicken and egg problem. You really can't answer this in a sense that how much regulation can be done. But I think there are fundamentals which can be addressed. So fundamentals like first, I mean, as coming from Urvashi's point, we need to have a minimum sense of even capacity. So if we need to have at least 20 people working on one of the fundamental problems, if you have to even address transparency or say bias, and get that group to really churn out in 1 year substantial legislation-based regulation, something to just address that one particular problem. What I'm trying to come to is that policy makers can have an overarching view of what the technology is working. The problem with AI is if you don't understand what the black box is doing, you really can't understand how to regulate it. So what policymakers can actually come in is to have a clear mandate for any AI application development to have a sort of clear-cut explanation. So you can actually understand a software development lifecycle. but you will not be able to understand A to B output of an AI algorithmic model unless, of course, there is some explanation given to you by, in detail. So that approach has to be there, so that anything which is developed in in any framework, whether it is agriculture or it is in education or healthcare, need to know that explanation, so that then you can address the question of bias, whether it is really biased or not, or it is transparent not, or what are the problems of what you can actually. And so there is a lot of effort in getting people, data scientists, to explain how the AI model is working. So maybe there has to be one focus. The second focus, it could be that the policymakers can take it a top-down and bottom-up approach, both sides, because it cannot just come down from a high-level perspective of answering that answering those questions on transparency and bias. Having said that, pilots should be conducted in terms of understanding what the output is. And India is such a diverse country, and algorithms are becoming so big that particular components of the algorithms can then be trained or tuned to address those particular biases. I mean, again, it's not a regulation question or a policy question, but I'm just trying to break it down into that. Okay, you can't really stop AI from coming in and one size fits all. But then what you can do is fit in these components where there is ease of operation. So if I'm doing something for disaster management, or for understanding, I don't know, forest cover in India or whatever, it's easier because there is information is beneficial to everyone. But if you do something on, say, healthcare and, say, personal data sets on COVID number, patients, or analysis on that, it might take a little bit harder regulation and more insight into getting that passed. Lastly, I think every state has a priority in what it wants to really achieve through utilizing AI. So maybe some work on its prioritization of how AI, should address its own needs should be given some leverage. So central bodies can actually do the larger strategic framework, and then tactical frameworks can be done by the states independently. Yeah. But big capacity is required. Big capacity. It's not a easy job. Yeah.
Thanks, Gaurav. So we have two questions. So before we go for the next one, which will be 2 minutes kind of thing, which I'll ask all of you. The first question is from Sanjeev Nagir. It says, are there any existing frameworks for security while building AI? Dr. Wong, you work in this particular area, frameworks and security. So if you can take that question, that's question number one. You see on the top.
Yes. Thank you, Prakash. I think basically it's a very good question. We are working on that, cybersecurity framework for AI. But just to let you know, there has existing work with the AI threat landscape from NIST, and also the guideline was published by NISA. If you take the particular use cases, for example, mobility or automotive domain, we are using the upcoming ISO 21434 standards, where this all can be also applied for the AI model, which is used in the mobility area. If you are taking non-mobility use cases, you can follow the basic principle from the security perspective, where we follow the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, where it means that the AI model itself needs to provide and protect confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Yeah, so basically this is the principle of framework you can follow to do a little bit assessment for, work for your AI model, is that to follow the security principles. Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Wong. Anyone else, if you would like to, Urvashi or Gaurav, want to add something, or I'll go to the next question, which is for Urvashi. Because she mentioned about AI systems using so much of energy. The question is how AI models are using so much of energy. So you explained, but again, I will request you to kindly take that question.
Sure. I mean, there's a long kind of technical explanation, but I think the simple, quick explanation is that it's the nature of machine learning and deep learning models. They require a huge amount of data. That data requires to be processed. It requires storage. It requires a huge amount of water to be able to cool these data centers. So we shouldn't think of AI as just existing in the cloud as some kind of ethereal technology. It has very, very real material components and material impacts.
Thanks, Urvashi. There is one question on views on PDPB, so that will be too big. We have just 7 minutes left. So let me go to the next question. He said, do you think sentiment AI be given the same rights as human? Very interesting question. Sentiment AI to be given the same rights as human.
Is that for me, or do you want?
Yeah.
I don't know. That's a really difficult question. I think we're far, far away from being able to answer it. I think what we need to focus on is to make sure that people's rights, humans' rights, are secured in an AI world before we start thinking about the rights of AI as an entity and as a legal entity.
Thanks, Urvashi. Okay, so this question I'll put it before Gaurav. It says, will too much regulation on AI kill the innovation?
I don't think so. We are capable of putting too much regulation. If you take the case of IT, when it started in 80s, I mean, the companies like Infosys and Wipro and all these actually grew up because there was less or unknown regulation. So now what is happening is everything is in the cloud. So you don't even understand, how these e-commerce like, Walmart or what you can say, Flipkart or Amazon are actually doing this. I would say emotional intelligence integration into their portals, right? So I don't think so there is something called too much regulation. I think there is something called, if we just start building on the fundamentals of regulation, it is required because AI will affect society in various ways, whether it is in profile of future of work or change of decision making or taking up jobs or whatever. In the Indian context, we are a developing economy. We have 90% of our people in informal economies. So we need to be very sure that we don't just make 5 big cities with 1,000 startups to grow, and then the rest of India is lagging behind. So regulation is required. Fundamentals, definitely, yes. We need to address these fundamental questions. Yeah.
So there is a question I'll just read out. It says, POP bill was drafted in 2019. We are in 2021 and technology changes every day. What do you think about the delay? Will the delay affect the policies which are drafted more than 2 years ago? So this is by Yatrat Budhiraja. Unfortunately, there is no from the government here. This is ideally, it should have been put before the government. So I'll pass it. I mean, I won't like to put any of the panelists who are from civil society or from academia or industry to be put into hotspot. So let me just go and ask 1 or 2 questions which I have. There's lots of talk that AI will reduce the employment or people who are getting jobs. That many of them, the repetitive jobs will get away. Now, what is your, how will AI impact labor markets in India, and what are the opportunities and challenges? Urvashi, if you can just tell us, take us through that.
Sure. Thanks, Prakash. I actually think the labor question is perhaps the most important or one of the most important questions in the Indian context. And it's also an example of why we need to have a conversation about AI governance that is very rooted in our socio-political reality. Because what we see in other industrialized economies, they don't have the kind of labor surplus that we have, right? So the kind of technological choices, the choices around automation that they are making in their geographies have to be different from what we make in ours. So I think it poses a severe kind of existential risk in the in the Indian context, because we have a huge labor force. We already have a problem in terms of creating adequate jobs and adequate good jobs, especially for young people. Young people are now more exposed to a global set of scenarios more than ever before. And what we are seeing in globally and in India is that, automation will impact kind of low scale, entry level, routine level jobs first, right? And so there is a huge bunch. And what that means is that it'll end up impacting those who are already in some sense at the bottom of the kind of job pyramid, who are the most vulnerable. So I think it's a major concern in India, and we have to think about this very carefully on where we want to use AI and where we want to not use AI from the perspective of labor. I think the second thing that we see happening in the Indian context and globally as well is the growing platformization of every sector, whether it's the health sector, it's the transport sector, it's the education sector. Now we're even seeing it in the government sector, right? They're creating platforms. This changes the nature of employment relationships. So people, rather than having full-time employment, become contractual workers, and that contractual work can be quite precarious, particularly when you don't have social protection frameworks in place. So again, I think that's particularly important in the Indian context. The third point I'd like to mention is what we see in the context, what we see increasingly is that a lot of machine learning technologies are being used to also monitor the productivity of labor. And so it's very important that we put the question of labor rights and labor privacy at the forefront of when we're thinking about AI regulation. So thinking about labor's data rights is particularly important in the Indian context. Thanks.
Thanks, Urvashi. In fact, I'm reminded of a case, I will not take the name, where the people who are the warehouses and take the things from the racks and put it in a box so that it can be delivered. Their efficiency is monitored to the hilt. In fact, if they take a break of 1 minute, someone starts talking, a machine starts saying that you haven't moved for 1 minute. Please move your backside and go to and do this work. Okay, so we have just 1 minute left, and I would like to thank all the participants, all the attendees, as well as all our panelists here who have given us lots of insight into where we are vis-a-vis AI, what kind of regulation we need to have, what are the things which have happened in EU and Singapore, and where we need to go, what kind of, and how fast we need to go. The last question I'll put to Gaurav is how to make AI the next IT revolution. You have worked in industry as well, so I thought, and we can close on that.
No, thank you, Prakash. I think you can't stop AI. It is going up, and you will have startups and unicorns coming out of AI in India, hopefully, inshallah. But the fact remains that we need to be sure that it is not affecting the marginalized in India. So anything, what has happened in India in the last 30 years is the inequality gap has increased. And I mean, I'm taking the fundamentals here, right? So any revolution which comes to life should not increase that, gap in the rich and the poor, and that's it. Any technology will survive and thrive. And people in India are very innovative in jugaad and items to really get things to life. But yeah, that's it. Thanks so much. Yeah.
So thank you, Dr. Wang. You've taken time out of your schedule and joined us from Singapore. Thanks, Urvashi, for joining us from Goa, and Gaurav from Delhi. Thank you all, and thanks all the attendees who are here. We are almost at the fag end. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Prakash. Thank you so much.
Prakash.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you.